Hi, y'all. I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. I'm Sarah Day Owen Wiskerson, editor and publisher for Raleigh Convergence. I'm so excited to be here today with Kat, who is the VP of Experience for CompostNow. Before we get started, I wanted to share just a little bit about why we're talking about composting today. So back in April, Raleigh Convergence announced that we were going to be focusing on local climate change and sustainability for a few months as our first converging topic. And at its heart, Converging Topics is a quarterly theme or topic, and it starts off pretty broad, but it's really shaped by community input. And in that very first survey, I learned that a lot of you were interested in sustainability and composting. And fortunately, Kat was willing to jump in and share some knowledge today. So she's going to make a short presentation today. And after that, I'm going to share some questions that y'all asked in one of the early type forms about composting specifically. And then Kat's going to answer some additional questions that maybe you have as as Kat's going through the presentation. And that's about it. If you could stay on mute unless you're talking, that would be great. And besides that, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Kat.
Thank you, Sarah Day. Thanks for having me, and thank you to all who have showed up today. I'm really excited to chat with y'all about composting. As you can probably tell, it's my favorite thing to talk about. So just real quick, like Sarah Day said, my name is Kat. I am the VP of Experience at CompostNow. I have been working at CompostNow for a little over 4 years at this point, but I've been in the composting industry for over 5. For those who have never heard of CompostNow, we are a local collection service who started in Raleigh in 2011. What we do is we help people compost. We help community members and local businesses divert their compostables from the landfill and instead use those nutrients to build healthy soil. So in short, we make composting really easy. I'm going to jump into my presentation now where I talk a little bit more about what composting is and why it's important. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to compost. And then I'm really looking forward to answering any questions y'all have. Don't be shy. I love to answer questions, so feel free to ask away. I'm going to share my screen now so that I can present my presentation. If anybody can't see or if I'm going too fast, you can please speak up in the chat. I get sometimes a little too excited. Okay, well, let's jump in. So before I talk about why composting is important or even how to compost, I really want to start with just the basics of what composting is. If you do a quick search in Google, a bajillion definitions come up and they're all slightly different. Some actually are totally different than others, and it can be a little bit confusing. So I wanted to make sure that we've kind of centered ourselves around what composting is. And by far, this is my favorite definition that I found. So composting is the controlled breakdown of organic material into a nutrient-rich soil amendment. And two very important parts of this definition that I want to touch on. First is the word controlled. Composting is science, but it's not rocket science. But it does require a level of know-how about how to do the process. Sometimes I get folks who will call into CompostNow and said, I'm already composting. I throw my scraps in the woods. And I have to stop them there and said, that's littering, not composting, and it's a little different. So I just want to make sure that we know that it is controlled. It does require time, energy, and labor. So again, a controlled process. And then the second part of this definition that I want to touch on is the phrase soil amendment. Some folks don't know that compost is not soil itself. It is an amendment to soil to help introduce the necessary nutrients required for plants. So if you try to plant a tomato plant in just compost, you'll see that it will not grow very well because it does require soil. So I just want to make sure folks know that compost is not soil itself. It's an amendment to soil. Okay, so now that we know what composting is, I'm really excited to chat more about why compost? Why is it important? And so at CompostNow, I like to say this phrase that I kind of use to talk more about the benefits of composting. I like to say that composting starves landfills and builds healthy soil. And most of the benefits will fall under one of those two categories. Um, the really cool thing about composting is that no matter what you care about, compost and soil itself really ties together humanity. So whatever you care about in this world, I can figure out a way to relate it back to composting, I promise. Um, okay, let's talk about why composting is important. So like I said, it stars landfills and fights climate change. And this is how. So right now in the US, 40% of food is wasted, and the majority of that food is sent to landfills where it's going to emit methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas that's 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So again, so much food in the US is wasted. And globally, if food waste was its own country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. So this is a very serious issue that people just often don't think about because we think of other emissions like driving our vehicles, those kind of emissions, but food scraps do contribute a lot to climate change. So when you're composting, you're avoiding those emissions altogether. And even more, what composting does to help fight climate change, and this was a really big reason why I got into this industry, is that it actually harnesses carbon currently in our atmosphere. So when you use compost and you put it into our local soils, what it does is it increases soil's ability to harness carbon in our atmosphere and draw it down and store it into our soils. So when we're talking about climate change, and I'm sure you guys have seen all of these studies regarding a tipping point that we're going to reach, we talk a lot. There's a ton of conversation around avoiding emissions, riding your bike instead of driving, cutting down on purchases. But we don't talk a lot about what we're doing with the greenhouse gases currently in our atmosphere. We must draw them down as well. So when you're composting, you're not only avoiding methane emissions, but you're also harvesting carbon in the process. So it's a very powerful tool to fight climate change. And it's actually called carbon harvesting. And it's obviously a huge tool that folks are doing a lot of research in academia right now, because it could be a very big solution to fighting climate change. And I want to stop right here to talk a little bit about how composting impacts environmental justice. And I'm just going to share just a very quick personal story of mine. I live in Durham County, so I am a Durham City resident. And a lot of people do not know that Durham's landfill has been closed since the late 90s. So people don't know that we are trucking our waste to an hour and 45 minutes one way to Sampson County. Did anybody in this room know that? I mean, if you guys are Raleigh residents, maybe not, but it's really surprising to folks to know that we don't have an active landfill in Durham. Instead, we're trucking it away. And who lives near those landfills that we're trucking our waste to? It's low-income minority community members who are having to take on the burden of our waste. Even if you think about the language regarding waste, it's very privilege coded, right? Throw it away. Where is away? It doesn't disappear. Somebody is being impacted by our waste. And oftentimes it's it's community members that have less privilege than all of us. So they're having to bear the burden of, contaminated groundwater, higher risk of birth defects from folks who live closer to landfills than people who don't. So I do want to touch on the fact that composting your food scraps instead of throwing it away helps fight that environmental justice that landfills create for our community members. And that was a question that we got before this, and I can touch on this a little bit more afterwards, but I felt like this was a good time to touch on that just briefly. All right, so we talked a little bit about how composting reduces food waste, it fights climate change, but it also builds healthy soil. And something I found during my entire education, I studied environmental science at UNC, was how often soil and the health of our soil was overlooked in all of my classes. It would always be briefly touched on and then quickly forgotten. And I always found that to be really funny because soil is one of our biggest resources. It is the ground beneath our feet. It contributes to so much of the health of our communities, and yet it's often overlooked. There's been studies that have shown that a carrot today versus a carrot eaten 40 years ago has less nutrients. And just let that sit with you. Why? We need nutrient-rich soil to grow nutrient-rich food. And right now, what we're doing with monoculture and urbanization is we're taking food out of the ground and we're not replacing those nutrients in our soil at the rate in which we're taking the nutrients out of our soil. Compost is one of the only organic ways to add nutrients to our soil and therefore our food. And it's just not prioritized enough, in my opinion, in our society. So I did want to touch on how compost does build healthy soil. So one of the biggest kind of mechanisms for this is that compost is different from fertilizer in one distinct way. The synthetic fertilizer that you see at Home Depot or in other garden centers, what that does is it feeds the plant directly. And usually in a way, we call it a nutrient blast. So you'll spray those nutrients on those plants, but those plants can only uptake those nutrients as at whatever rate they need it. So oftentimes the rest of those nutrients are washed away with erosion. However, what composting does is it feeds the soil, which then feeds the plant. So the plants are actually able to receive nutrients in a slow mechanism uptake whenever they need it. So I like to say it's kind of like a 3-course meal versus a one-time buffet like fertilizer is. So that's a little bit of how compost builds healthy soil, which is required to grow healthy food and to have healthy community members. That was a lot. I can touch on questions later, but now I want to jump into how to compost. We know what it is. We know why it's direly important, but let's talk about ways that you can compost yourselves. So first, I do want to touch on the recipe, I like to call it, of composting. Composting does require a ratio of materials that I want to touch on. So there's 4 main ingredients to composting. And if you think of composting similar to baking, this ratio makes a lot more sense, right? Baking is a science. If one of your ingredients is off, it may turn into a totally different dessert. And I have done that many, many times. So it does require a very balanced ratio of these 4 ingredients. 1, you need greens. These are the materials that are going to provide nitrogen to your compost pile. And these are things primarily like food scraps and fresh grass clippings. The second thing we need are brown materials. These are the woody carbon materials that's going to add carbon to your pile. These are things like wood chips, leaves, sawdust, those type of woody carbon materials. And then the last 2 things, and we need these 2 things because we're feeding microbes. They're living things, and all living things need oxygen and water. So for the ratio, you see on this slide, it says 25:1 browns to greens. Volume-wise, that equals about 4 parts brown to 1 part green. And if you take anything away from this slide, what you need to know is you need far more browns than greens in your pile. All of the compost piles I've looked at for folks who've needed my help, I will say the majority of the challenges that come with their compost pile is that they simply just do not have enough browns. So again, you want to make sure you have 4 part browns to 1 part green. So 1 bucket full of food scraps, you're going to need 4 of those buckets of leaves or sawdust or other carbon materials. Oxygen, you must, and this is probably the biggest challenge for homeowners or folks who are trying to compost on their own in their backyard, is you have to flip your pile at least once every 2 weeks. You must. If you do not, oftentimes your pile will become anaerobic, meaning it's absent of oxygen, and then it becomes a totally different process. It becomes an anaerobic pile, which actually attracts anaerobic microbes who will break down those materials and release methane in the process. So again, that's the same system in landfilling, and we're trying to avoid that. So you must introduce oxygen in your pile so that aerobic microbes can survive. And then finally, your pile should feel a little moist, kind of like a wrung out sponge. So what I like to do is I take a handful and I squeeze it. If it's sopping, it's too wet and you need to add more browns. It should just feel like a wrung out sponge. If it's dusty, it's way too dry and you need to add some more water to make sure that it has some moisture in that pile. That was a crash course, and I can talk a little bit more about that momentarily. But I do just want to share the difference between a backyard composting system and a system that we use at CompostNow. Because if you've ever interacted with our service, you can probably tell that we take a lot more material than what you can personally compost in your backyard. So just as a rule of thumb, if you are composting in your backyard by yourself, your pile should have a vegan diet. So no meat, no dairy, no bones. It should be vegan, I like to say. If you are using a service like ours, you will see that you can actually compost meat and dairy and bones with our service. And I just want to explain why, because I don't want that to be confusing. The reason we can take those hard to compost materials is because of the type of system we have. Our system is called WINDROW composting. So here's a quick picture of it. If you look at the word WINDROW, you can kind of see how our system works. So what we do is we partner with a commercial facility who builds these huge piles. And if you can see, I don't know if you can really tell the scale here, but these piles can be 8 feet tall and 16 feet wide. They are massive. And then what we do is our commercial facility introduces oxygen using this equipment. So we're able to turn one of these piles within 30 minutes. If we had to do this by hand, it would take us a year. They're massive. So the main difference here is the volume. When you're composting in your backyard, it's usually you and just your household's waste, and that's not a ton of food waste volume like it is here. So the reason we can take those materials is because the volume is so large, it creates the heat column necessary to break down those hard to compost materials. If anybody in this room has a pile, I bet you it rarely gets up to 160 degrees. And that is the temperature required to break down meat and dairy and those hard to compost materials like compostable cups, those types of materials. So again, I just want to share that the reason we can take it is because the temperatures of our pile hits 160 versus a backyard system rarely gets close to 160 and usually hovers around 130 if it's well maintained. Okay. Again, just real quick, this is all the things that we can accept with our system. These are things you can also compost in your backyard outside of, like I said earlier, the meat, dairy, bones, and compostable plastics. So with CompostNow and services like ours, we can take a lot more material than you can in your backyard. Doesn't mean we're better. I always like to say, no matter how you're composting, it's just important that you are composting, and whatever system works for you is the best system for you. Here's some common contaminations that we see just for y'all to be aware of as well. If you're trying to compost with us or in your backyard, obviously no recyclables in general. Let's get them in the recycling bin so that they can get another life as another material. We do not accept diapers, even though there are compostable diapers, and technically human waste is compostable. However, to process human or pet waste, it must be processed in a separate facility than other compostables, just because of public health and yeah, you can probably tell why. We do have dreams of starting a compost service for pet waste called CompostNow. We just haven't figured it out yet. And I just want to quickly touch on CompostNow. I don't want this to be any kind of ad. I just want to share more about us in case you see us around town. Again, Raleigh is our home. We started here. Our headquarters is here. A majority of our team is here. So Raleigh is really near and dear to our hearts. Yeah, we just are a bunch of scrappy mothers, fathers, community members, movers and shakers who are just really passionate about helping people compost and rebuilding our soils. Like I mentioned, we started in 2011 with the hopes and dreams of making compost easy. We felt like people really want to do well. They just need an easy way to do it. And if we can make it easy, more people will compost. Fast forward 10 years, I think our hypothesis is correct. We are now in 4 different locations, and we service anybody who creates compostables, we will service them. To date, our members have diverted over 31 million pounds of compostables from the landfill, which has created over 10 million pounds of compost for local use. And like I mentioned, we don't want to create compost for the sake of compost. We want compost in our soils. That is where it is its highest purpose and use. And so what we actually do is we give compost back to our members. But if members who live in an apartment or they don't need the compost back themselves, they can actually pick one of our garden partners to share it with, and we'll share that compost with our garden partner on their behalf. So we do support a lot of amazing local organizations doing incredible work in our community. And these are just a few of the garden partners that we do partner with at the moment. And that is it for my presentation. I know that was a really quick and dirty, I love puns. I know it was a very quick and dirty presentation about composting, but I hope you guys got some sense of composting 101, or at least you've taken something away from that. And now I would love to answer any and all questions and kind of start a discussion.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead by asking some of the questions that we got in advance. And one of those was talking about composting. So composting at home in a tumbler. Could you tell us a little bit more about how to do that? Details about how that might be different than some of the processes you outlined before?
Absolutely. And I think this is a great question for me to touch on 4 of the most popular ways to compost at your home. So the first is buying a tumbler. I'm sure you guys have seen tumblers. They're enclosed containers, oftentimes on some sort of structure that allows you to turn it manually. Some are freestanding as well. There's a million different designs. And actually some municipalities give residents free tumblers. I know the city of Cary does. I'm not sure about Raleigh, but you are able to get oftentimes free tumblers from municipalities. So tumblers are tricky, and I'm just going to be honest here. Tumblers are probably one of the trickiest ways to compost at your house. And the only reason I say that is because it kind of creates this out of sight, out of mind mentality. It is an enclosed system, which is great if you have very strict HOA rules regarding compost piles, which unfortunately a lot of neighborhoods do, or if it just doesn't flow with your landscaping design and you want it to be kind of out of sight, out of mind. But with those benefits, create a couple challenges. Like I mentioned, you got to turn your compost for it to break down properly. And with tumblers, oftentimes if it starts getting overloaded, meaning it's not breaking down fast enough as you're adding new material, it can often get so heavy you can't physically turn it. I've seen that more often than not. And so that actually makes people not turn it. And then they just get this soppy, soaking wet compost inside that never fully breaks down. So you have to be very careful with your ratios in a tumbler, meaning if you're adding as you go, if you're adding in some food scraps, make sure you're also adding in that carbon at the same time, and make sure you're either flipping it by turning it manually, or if it's standing up, make sure that you put a pitchfork in and flip it as best as you can. Like I mentioned, it is one of the toughest ways to compost because it's just logistically really hard to turn. And that's one of the biggest requirements for composting. So not trying to deter anybody from that method, just letting you know the challenges to be aware of when you go in. But if you have a lot of pest issues, it's also a really good solution for that since it's enclosed.
Good to know. So someone asked about options if they live in a condo or an apartment, basically if they don't have access to a yard.
Perfect. So we talked about tumblers as one of the 4 ways to compost. You can use a service like ours, or a drop-off center like the city of Raleigh actually has a drop-off cart of ours that people can go and drop off their food scraps for free at the convenience center. So that's the second way, is using a service or a drop-off option. The other 2 ways that you can take advantage of in an apartment or in a condo is vermicomposting. Is anybody familiar with vermicomposting? So verma means worm. So it's composting using worms. And it's not just any worms. You can't just go pick out some worms in your yard and add them to a container for vermicomposting. You actually have to have a very specific type of worm. They're called red wigglers, and they've been bred to be able to break down 5 times their weight in food. So you actually utilize worms to break down food scraps using vermicomposting. There are a ton of different vermicomposting designs online that I encourage you to explore if this is something you're interested in. I know a lot of people who live in apartment complexes who have a vermicomposting container because it is small. You can fit it under your sink. You don't have to produce a lot to maintain it. The only thing to keep in mind is that worms do not like citrus. And I must tell you one quick little horror story of mine. I have composted in every way imaginable, and vermicomposting was one of the first. And I had a disaster happen to me when I vermicompost. I was just learning, so I wasn't super aware that worms can't break down citrus, and they have a big diversion for citrus. And I added citrus to my container. In vermicomposting, you poke holes in your container to add oxygen to keep your worms alive. I came home one day and they had escaped through the holes, and there were worms all over my house.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was a horror story. It's just because I added so many like lemon peels and was not aware that worms were not into it, and they escaped. And ever since then, I have never done it again since then. But so many other people have successfully vermicompost, and it is a great option for folks who don't produce a ton of food scraps and live in a smaller space. So if you're in an apartment, you can vermicompost. You can partner with a friend who maybe has more space and yard to have a big system, or you can use the service or drop-off option.
Cool. So the last question that we were asked, which speaks to the environmental justice issue that you were talking about earlier, is more of a big picture question, which is how can sustainability and composting be more accessible to all versus only those with privilege, land, that sort of thing?
I love that question, and whoever asked that, thank you so much. I think it's so important to always have environmental justice centered in these conversations because it's so incredibly important. So I touched a little bit on how composting kind of fights environmental injustice as it relates to landfilling, but I do just want to briefly touch on the compost movement in general and how it's working to fight these environmental injustices that we so often see. So when I think of environmental justice, we must talk about the 3 main areas in which we can affect environmental injustice and fight it. 1 is personal responsibility, 2 is corporate responsibility, and 3 is policy. Oftentimes in conversations, we touch on 1, maybe 2, or 1 is the main focus, right? What are you doing as an individual to fight environmental justice? What are you doing for our environment? But we have to have all 3 to truly make a difference. And so I kind of want to talk about how the composting movement and CompostNow is helping address each 3 of these. So 1 is personal responsibility. Studies have shown that folks with a higher income have a larger carbon footprint. And that makes sense if you think about it. They consume more. They're contributing to carbon emissions at a higher rate. So when we're talking about personal responsibility, we have to keep that in mind, as the folks who can afford to compost should compost. End of story, right? If you have the disposable income or the space or even the know-how to compost, it is your responsibility to do so, because we are impacting our lower income community members. Because not just climate change is going to affect our low income community members first. They do not have the money to relocate from coastal areas whenever coastal areas are getting flooded, right? As we're seeing at a higher rate because of climate change. So I always like to say, with personal responsibility, that's how composting can address that. Is if you have a disposable income, if you're not composting on your own, I encourage you to pay for a service to do so, because you are helping fight that environmental injustice for those people. It is not their duty to, right? They have too many other challenges to face to compost on their own. A lot of folks ask CompostNow, they say, well, I wish, your service was a lot cheaper so everybody can compost. And this is kind of our stance, and this is where I touch on our corporate responsibility. We are not the only way to compost by far. And we are not even telling people we are the best. We are one option, and it's an option for folks who can't compost on their own. They don't know how, they don't have the time, but there are so many different ways to compost. But us putting that responsibility on folks who are juggling 3 to 4 jobs, who are trying to feed their children, who are just trying to make it through the day, that is not responsible for us to put that burden on them. Instead, we need to take that burden off of them and do our part first. And let me tell you a little bit about how CompostNow is trying to address this issue on a larger scale. This is a perfect group to talk about it with. We partner with the city of Raleigh to help provide composting services for their convenience center. So community members can, for free, drop off their food scraps at a drop-off location at one of the Wake County convenience centers. We also work really hard to partner with local municipalities to eventually bring composting to the masses. We dream of being able to work with cities so that composting is another bin right beside your recycling and trash, so that it's affordable for everybody to partake and it's accessible for everybody. Obviously, this is a very big dream, but we're actively working on developing those relationships with municipalities so that we can bring composting to more people, just like they're doing in Seattle and San Francisco. It has been done and we can do it. We just need the right people working on it and the right push. So that's corporately how we are addressing this. But another way that other corporations help fight environmental injustice is to put their money where their mouth is, right? They should be composting. They should be making an effort to be as sustainable as possible. That is what we should pressure corporations to be doing. They need to hold their weight in this fight, especially when they're contributing at a lot higher percentage of greenhouse gases than an individual is. And then thirdly, policy. I don't think I need to touch on too much of that, but we know if we want great change, especially in the environmental industry and the environmental movement, policy must be addressed at the same time. Here's an example. Austin just came out with, or a couple years ago, came out with a very aggressive waste reduction goal. They wanted to reduce their waste into landfills by 50% by 2050. That's a great idea in theory, but the policy wasn't in place at the same time. Even if they could do that, y'all, there's not enough commercial facilities in Austin to be able to process those materials. So it's kind of this like empty promise without the policy to go alongside it. So that's the third piece that we must keep our policymakers accountable for when they're rolling out these really aggressive sustainability goals. Is that's nice and all, but how are we going to actually make that happen? And what are the policies in place to set us up for success? Oh, that was
Great.
such a ramble. I'm sorry. I hope that was direct enough, but yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that was great. So I saw a couple questions in the chat, and I'm happy to ask those to Kat. But if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to do so.
I'll just speak up. I saw the pizza boxes, and that was intrigued me. Do they take long to break down?
They do not. Pizza boxes are so interesting because a lot of folks want to recycle them, but you can't because they're food soiled. So any food soiled cardboard you can add to your compost pile. What I suggest is if you have a pile at your house, Dorothea, be sure to rip up the pizza box because it increases the surface area and will be broken down quicker. So rip it up and the microbes will go crazy.
All right, great.
Yep.
Cool, thanks, Dorothea. So Kristen asked about dryer lint. Kristen heard that dryer lint can count for browns, but lint can include plastics and synthetics, and maybe not.
Great question. So Kristen, at CompostNow, our policy is we do not take dryer lint or vacuum lint either, or the stuff that you have in your vacuum bag, because exactly what you said. Even if just like one thing in your dryer isn't like 100% compostable, those fibers will end up in the dryer lint and ultimately will not be broken down in your compost pile. So unfortunately, it's kind of like even one little bit ruins the whole batch. So we always just say no. Similar to kind of like human or pet hair, like theoretically that is compostable, but we cannot be sure that all the material or like stuff in, dyes in your hair, shampoo is fully compostable. So unfortunately, it's one of those things where inherently it's compostable, but because of all the materials added into it, it becomes not compostable.
Interesting. Jeffrey asked about tools for turning composting systems freestanding, and are bugs a bad indication in a compost?
Ooh, great question. Great, Jeffrey. The two biggest tools I recommend is a pitchfork, especially if you have a freestanding compost pile or any kind of component compost pile. A pitchfork is great because not only are you able to use it to flip, but it aerates your pile really, really well and like breaks up a lot of clumpy material that you may have in your pile. And then I recommend a shovel just to be able to shovel large amounts of carbon onto your pile. Quick little tip, before you walk away from your pile after you flip it, coat it with a thin layer of carbon. What that does is it kind of secures the heat and breaks down your pile a lot quicker. For what tools do you recommend? Okay. For bugs, not necessarily, right? The heroes of composting, a lot of people think it's worms. It only is really when you're talking about vermicomposting. But the real heroes in a compost pile are microbes. And you can't see the microbes, but they are there actively working. When you see heat come from your pile, that's an indication that you have very happy microbes. They're breaking down the material and they're releasing heat in the process. So bugs inherently aren't bad. A lot like the wiggle, I call them the roly-poly-olies. You'll see those, you'll see worms. Those are kind of micro decomposers. So they're helping kind of break down large pieces of material into smaller materials for the microbes. So it's not a bad thing. What you should look out for though, is if you have a lot of ants in your pile, that's a bad indication that it has too much carbon and you need to add a little bit more nitrogen. But your pile shouldn't be abnormally buggy, right? It's in your backyard, so you're going to have bugs regardless, but it shouldn't be overwhelmingly buggy. If it is, you need to add a little bit more carbon. And I like to say, people think that compost piles smell. If it smells very bad, your ratio is off. Let me share 2 quick tips, Jeffrey, because you may benefit from this. If it's not breaking down at all, if your pile is not getting hot enough, what you're going to want is to add nitrogen. If it smells like pneumonia or if it has any bad smell, you need to add carbon. So those are 2 of the biggest kind of challenges is 1, it's not breaking down. You need to add food scraps and you need to flip it. And if it smells like pneumonia or smells bad in any way, you need to add more carbon.
Great. All right, so I don't have any other questions in the chat. Is there anybody else who wants to unmute, ask a question while we have Kat here?
Kat, what about, this is Jeffrey, what about roaches, like outdoor roaches that maybe are getting in there?
Yeah, Jeffrey, yes. Yeah, roaches are an indication that the newer food scraps that you've added to your pile hasn't been buried. So, Jeffrey, do you do an add as you go method?
Yes.
Okay. So if you're doing an add as you go for the rest of y'all, if you're not familiar, is different from stockpiling. A lot of folks stockpile their food scraps by freezing them or just making sure they have a lot and then they build a new pile and then they repeat that and build a new pile. Add as you go is the most common for homeowners or folks that are composting on their own just because it makes more sense with your lifestyle. You're eating continuously. So when you're adding new green material, so new food scraps, what I like to do is I make a little hole right in the center where it's hottest. I add the food scraps and then cover it with carbon so that roaches, mice, and raccoons do not smell it and do not find it. I live in Durham, and particularly where I live, Jeffrey, we do have a little bit of a roach problem. And so I have found that by burying it, it has decreased the amount of roaches significantly. You will still have some just by nature, but it will reduce it quite a bit if you bury it.
Cool. Yeah, that's good to know. Also, it gets a little sludgy. This has been very informative. So thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Jeffrey, another thing, well, never mind. Yeah, sludgy. Yeah, I actually messed up when I put my first pile in my house. I put it in a place that didn't have great irrigation. So like there would be a lot of standing water after a big rain, and it was just my fault for picking like the wrong location in the corner of my lot. And I should have picked it where there was more parched sun and had a slight incline or decline so that water would run off a little bit better. That was my fault. I've learned since then.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Well, I also wanted to keep this to 45 minutes, keep it super concise. So that way, we had a ton of information, but also I know that Zoom fatigue is real. So I'm very grateful for your time. I'm so grateful to Kat for her informative presentation, answering all of these questions. Super helpful. Thank you so much. And if you joined late or anything like this, I'm going to have this on the YouTube and I'll share it in the newsletter later. But thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Kat.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah Day, for having me. And y'all have been wonderful. Thank you for the excellent questions and for being so engaged in this presentation.
Yeah. All right. Well, y'all have a good Monday.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.